Hey everyone, I'm Pastor Alec,
I'm Eli.
and we're continuing to talk through the Bible, specifically talking through Genesis, and we've gone through pretty much the whole thing at this point.
Yeah.
So, so Eli, you had some questions. What have you got for me?
Okay, so I read chapters 46 to 50 this week.
Yep.
And I did have one question from 46.
Okay.
Let's get that pulled up here.
Yep.
It was in the famine in Egypt, and Joseph had sold grain to everybody, and they ran out of money. And they
Yes.
started selling their livestock and their land, and then they ended up selling themselves as well.
Yes.
Were they slaves exactly, or were they just more kind of like, because it said they give a fifth of their food, or are they just really kind of indebted to the Pharaoh?
Well, I think in some ways it really shows that Pharaoh goes from being it seems like within the narrative again. I think we talked a little bit about this last time. Like in Egypt, there's a lot of change going on at this time. Okay, and socially, religiously, and it's going to continue to happen. And so the way that it seems in Genesis is almost like Pharaoh's kind of the guy in charge, maybe the high priest, he's the king. But here he really becomes almost like an authoritarian, like a much more authoritarian ruler.
Right.
Like he's like an autocrat, which, I mean, you can kind of get that sense from him being king before too. But it's almost more so here. It's like, yeah, he like owns everything and
Right.
everybody. And it really does, that sets you up for the picture that we see at the beginning of Exodus when God's people are enslaved.
Right.
So this is kind of setting the groundwork for that.
Okay.
So yeah, he seems to be accumulating authority over everything and everyone
Right.
in a way that he didn't have it before, even if he
Yeah.
was king.
And when I was reading that, I was like kind of twisted about it, because I was being like, "Oh, that's awful. Why would he do that to everybody?" But then again, he's keeping them alive.
Yeah.
And they're also thankful for it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of something that we've got to reckon with. That's really difficult because, on the one hand, and Joseph is the instrument for this.
Yeah.
Right. Joseph is the one who's making it all happen. He's giving all of his power to Pharaoh, and in some ways taking advantage of the people, it seems. But again, they welcome this because they're getting food in the midst of the
Right.
famine, and it really just kind of shows you that. Like this is in Genesis. Genesis gets us from the beginning of everything to God's people waiting in Egypt in slavery.
Right.
Right. And so this is one of the major steps that gets us there.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remembered now, with, what is it? Ephraim
Yeah. Ephraim and Manasseh.
and Manasseh. When Joseph moved his hands,
Yeah.
he
Yes.
said, "In your name, Israel will pronounce this blessing. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh."
Yes.
What is that blessing?
Well, Ephraim. See, I think we've talked about before how the tribes of Israel, much later when they actually become tribes,
Right.
not just Jacob's sons or Israel's sons, that there is a certain kind of characterization that takes place in Genesis that kind of maybe tells you something about how the tribes were.
Okay.
And so what happens is when in 400 years, when the Israelites do enter the land, Joseph doesn't have a portion of the land directly.
Okay.
He has a portion through Manasseh and Ephraim.
Okay, yeah.
And Ephraim Manasseh, half of the tribe settles on the east of the Jordan, and the other half settles on the west side of the Jordan, actually in the promised land.
Yeah.
And Ephraim becomes like the biggest tribe.
Okay.
And so it really, in a lot of ways, Ephraim will eventually become shorthand for referring to the northern kingdom of Israel.
Okay.
So yeah, there is this switch,
Right.
like we'd expect that. It's almost like Joseph should know better,
Yeah.
and he tries to get his dad to give the blessing to the right people, and of course there's the switch, just like what happens with Jacob himself, right?
Yeah.
And his brother Esau, and that's kind of becomes a norm.
Yeah.
So yeah, in later years, and hundreds of years later, Ephraim and Manasseh are viewed as they are powerhouses.
Okay.
Because these are the sons of Joseph that have been adopted by Jacob. And so that means that Joseph has a double portion,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so in the end, when this all comes out, it's like you've got Judah and Zebulun and Naphtali and Gad and Asher and Reuben and Simeon and Levi and all the tribes, and there's Benjamin and Joseph, and it turns out that Joseph's sons are actually put on par with their uncles.
Right. So now, in that, did they kind of take Joseph's place?
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Yeah. And that's why, again, when you look at the tribes of Israel, and there's, kind of like 13 tribes.
Yeah.
Because there is no Joseph. Instead, you get Manasseh and Ephraim.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, and that was about all I had for what I read.
Okay. Yeah, there a lot of that at the end. There is blessings. Why don't we, although let's, just to kind of close it all out, I do think it should be, well, we've talked about this a little bit, and so I want to go through the first four brothers, because this has come up, okay? So in chapter 49, and then let's do the very end in chapter 50, because I think these are really kind of important points here, is that, so Jacob calls his sons and says, "Gather yourselves together that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come." So this is the blessings, right? Yeah. It says, "Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel your father." So now he is Israel, right? And so I don't want to go through all the blessings, just the first four, because they came up before, all right? And so I think this is important. It says, "Reuben, you are my firstborn. May my might and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch." Okay, so remember we talked about with Bilhah, how Reuben, so he lost his birthright. So this is just, we've talked about this, so I just kind of want to read through this. Okay, next up. Simeon and Levi together, because we see them with Dinah in that whole thing, and Shechem together. All right. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords, right? Because that's what happens in the story.
Right.
"Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." Now I want you to think, all the tribes have their different land. Where's Levi's land eventually when they come into the promised land? He doesn't have any.
I was going to say.
Because those are the priests. They have their own little sanctuary cities, but the priests don't get land. And these are the Levites. And this is here, it's seen as you're scattered.
Okay. I didn't know Levi had Levites.
Yeah, the Levites.
Okay,
That Leviticus, that's where that word comes from. Leviticus, right? The Levitical law code. And of course, we've got some famous Levites. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam are all Levites. Okay, those siblings are all Levites. And that's where the priests come from. So they are scattered.
Right.
All right. So this is the last one I'll do. Is Judah is next. Remember, he's the fourth born. And remember, he's been portrayed in a very positive light, much better than the others.
Right.
And his is looking at it now. His is the second longest. The only one that's longest is Joseph. Okay, that's the only one that's longer. So here, "Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you." So you'd expect this to be Joseph.
Right.
But it's not.
Yeah.
Okay. "Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion. And as a lioness, who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him." Now, you'd expect this, again, to be from Joseph, especially considering the whole situation going on in Egypt, and Joseph is acting as ruler of Egypt.
Right.
And, in 400 years, they're going to go into the promised land, and uh, maybe longer than 400, and then it's going to be another 400 years before they even get a king, and he can even talk about having a scepter.
Right.
Okay, and it's going to be from Saul, who's not even from the tribe of Judah. So he's going to rule, and then his son Ishbosheth is going to rule, right?
Right.
And David is finally going to rule as from the tribe of Judah. So we're talking about events that are going to take place like 900 years from now,
Right.
Right?
That's
So,
crazy.
okay, so you can see though how these details might be important during the time of King David. All right. All right, so, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples, binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He has washed his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. Okay, which is so interesting.
Right.
So anyway, I think it's important to kind of note that these are the blessings, and you can see how the blessings they come out of the entire Joseph and his brothers' narrative.
Right.
Right? Okay, now, of course, Jacob ends up dying at the end of Genesis, and after he blesses his sons, and then after that happens, Joseph's brothers come to him, and they're afraid.
Yeah.
And they say, hey, before our dad died, he told us that you need to forgive us. And you kind of wonder, did Jacob really say, hey, Joseph, you need to forgive your brothers? Or is this something they're kind of making up? Kind of sounds like it's something they're making up.
He would
I
have
don't know.
told Joseph. If
That, the jury's still out on that one. Who knows? But Joseph tells them what you meant for evil, God meant for good.
Right.
Okay, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, and you can see that. Then how that it's played itself out.
We have talked about how, because he ended up in jail after he was sold.
Yeah.
And after that, he was second to the king.
Right.
So,
So God is the one who's in control.
Right.
And so, and actually here it's, so they come to him, it's in chapter 50, verse 19. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And that's the kind of the ending of the story of Joseph and his brothers, and that it ends with his death. And Joseph wants, along with Jacob, he wants to be buried back into his homeland in the land of Canaan.
Right.
And so they embalm him. He's mummified, basically.
Yeah.
He's mummified. And then when they leave in the Exodus, they carry his mummy out with them to bury him in the land of his fathers.
Right.
Okay, so
I was gonna ask.
Yeah.
When he said, "Don't be afraid, am I in the place of God?" Is that like the first occurrence of someone like turning the other cheek in Genesis? Because I don't think I've seen that.
Yeah, I don't know if
before.
you've seen. Right,
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. It might. I mean,
Yeah.
it certainly is. It certainly is kind of put up as this is a culmination of it all.
Right.
I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, it might
I'll probably
be.
go look at that.
Yeah, it might be. That'd be interesting to take a look at that. Yeah. But you do see, right? You see that. You see this is forgiveness.
Right.
Is the way of God.
Yeah.
Right. Forgiveness is the way of God, and you see again this entire thing that he says here. It's like Genesis begins with God creating things, everything through His Word. He speaks it into existence. And he's so close, and he's walking in the garden, and he's close with Abraham even, and even the Tower of Babel, he's up in heaven, kind of looking down. But he seems like he can just kind of come in whenever he wants to, and does. And then he starts to appear to, he appears to Jacob in night visions, and it's still him.
Right.
And then in Joseph, it's more symbolic dreams. And again, you see the word Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh used a lot more at the beginning, and which is more, we talked about this, more imminent. And Elohim used towards the end a lot more transcendent. And so you almost see God as appears to becoming more distant in his interaction with his creation, or at least that would be like the perception of humans.
Yeah.
And then in Exodus, it begins with, the Israelites have multiplied. There's a new Pharaoh that doesn't know them. He decides to enslave them. And so his people cry out, and he remembers them.
Right.
But there's almost, and there's this distance. So Exodus then begins with the distance. And do you know how Exodus ends? Exodus 40 is after Moses come down from the mountain. They've built the tabernacle, and Exodus 40 is him filling the tabernacle with his glory to dwell with him.
Oh, yeah.
So Genesis begins close up, intimate, and it ends with God distant. Exodus begins with God distant,
Right.
and ends with him being very close and intimate with his people.
Well, I can't. Oh, going back, speaking on Genesis,
Yeah.
God is, at first, he's there, active, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then even with that, he's kind of even more passive than he would be in coming in a dream.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
I just thought about that. Thought that was neat.
Right. Yeah, and then Exodus, there's parts of it where he engages Moses in the burning bush.
Right.
And he
Yeah.
guides the people of Israel out with fire by day or smoke by day and fire by night, right? Which is probably just the same thing, but in the daytime you see smoke, and in the
Right.
nighttime you see the fire, right? And he's there on the very close to Moses, to the point
Right.
where it almost kills Moses how
Yeah.
close he is on Mount Sinai, and then he fills the tabernacle, and so
Yeah,
it's like he's there, kind of in, and so he's very close up and imminent rather than transcendent,
Right.
throughout Exodus, right? But it begins with him distant and
Yeah.
transcendent, so. All right. Well, I think you had some questions for to kind of overview then
Right.
of the whole book.
So I know I was in 49. This is about all of Genesis. But
Yeah,
This,
okay,
this
okay.
reminded me when they were mourning Jacob.
Yes.
Oh, okay, I did. In verse 11, when they found the Egyptians. Oh, this isn't in 49. It might be in 50.
Okay. 50 verse
But yeah, verse 11.
11, right?
When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they
Yes.
said, the Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning. That is why this place near the Jordan is called Abel Mizraim.
Okay.
Is that, will you find things like naming the mountain throughout the entire Bible, or is that just something you see in Genesis to kind of
Oh, they name
Sit
things
there.
like that. They have symbolic names of
Okay,
the
yeah.
entire Old
Yeah.
Testament.
I was just wondering.
They will always, they will make, it's like when the tribes, there's 2.5 tribes that don't settle across the Jordan. They cross, they help fight, and then they come back.
Yeah.
And then they set up pillars, stones to commemorate, the crossing of the Jordan, and that even though they're on different sides of the river, they're still the same people.
Right.
And they give it a name. They always
Okay,
it's
yeah.
something's always got a name.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Another question.
Hebrew is filled with meaningful names.
Yeah, I've noticed that, especially with actual people's names.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
How far into, I guess, history have we gotten? How old is the Earth?
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, so Genesis, I think so between the 4 narratives within Genesis, again, creation goes from 1 to 11, and then Abraham and Sarah, and then Jacob, and then Joseph and his brothers. Those are the 4 narratives that we've talked about. And we can pinpoint Abraham to about 1900 BC. Okay, so that's a pretty solid number, rough number, right? Estimate. And so that's not that difficult. Before Abraham, it gets a little more difficult.
Yeah.
Because remember, what's so different about the Genesis 1 through 11 narrative is that it's talking about a time before now, right? So you notice, like, even when the Israelites, when they talk about their ancestors, they talk about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah.
And so, Jacob is like the father of, he's Israel.
Right.
And then Isaac is kind of like the grandfather, and Abraham is the great grandfather.
Right.
And he is the one that God calls out of Babylon,
Yeah.
of the Babel civilization. And so beyond that, they don't say the God of Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right.
Right? That's not even a Noah. Noah is from a time before their time.
Right.
And so that makes it really difficult to trace back and say, okay, well, how much time has actually passed here? Has it been a few thousand years? Has it been longer?
Right.
Right? And this is what people debate about, right? How much time was exactly the first day?
Yeah.
Did it take 25 seconds?
Right.
We talk
Yeah.
about like 24 hours or something, but he said there's darkness, and then he says, let there be light. It's like, well, that doesn't take very
Yeah,
long.
That was a day. That would technically be a day.
That's right. And so people have gone through and talked about that and attacked that from all different kinds of angles.
Right.
Which makes it really difficult. How long does the Spirit of God hover over the surface of the waters, of the deep?
Right.
Who knows,
Yeah.
right? Now, Exodus later on they'll talk about 6 days. And so, especially when we're talking about like remembering the Sabbath day, the seventh day. And you got to think, for an ancient Israelite, the way that they're telling this narrative, well, they probably just think, well, a day is, I guess, a day like I experience it.
Right.
Right? But it is really difficult to kind of get into the mind of an ancient Israelite as you're reading these texts, right? So the other thing that you have to take into account is, like, when you're doing the genealogies in Genesis 4 and 5, these are genealogies probably of like kings, right?
Okay.
So, so you see big numbers, which actually change between the Greek and the Hebrew and the Greek traditions.
Okay.
They're shorter in the Septuagint text.
Right.
So it's like, how do you make sense of it all?
Right.
And so
Yeah.
again, I think it's safe just to say Abraham. That's very clear. You're talking about 1900 BC.
Yeah.
And you can talk about the world that he lives in. You can study, ancient Babylon, ancient, Egypt, Sumeria, Acadia. You can study those civilizations that are going on around that time.
Right.
But Genesis before that is really, really focused on setting up the Abraham narrative,
Right.
getting us from the God creating the world up to Abraham. And it's focused on also responding to the religions that were around at that time.
Right.
So God creating everything through His Word is completely different than the mythology of the ancient Akkadians,
Right.
and Sumerians, right? Completely different. They believe that God that there was a council of gods, and that there was a disruption in the council of gods between a god and a goddess.
Right.
Tiamat, the goddess of basically sour water, and the god Marduk, and they fight with each other, and as they're fighting, the world is created, and other gods are born, the god of the earth and the god of the fresh. There's all
Right.
kinds of things going on. I think it was Apu, is the god of the fresh water, and eventually what happens is Marduk takes his bow, and he fires it at Tiamat, and it splits Tiamat in half. Okay.
With land.
Well, with his bow, so you get the waters below and the waters above.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
and it's interesting because when it says the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the surface of the deep, the Hebrew word is tehom, which sounds a lot like Tiamat,
Tiamat, yeah.
right? And then you think about it, when God floods the whole earth. He brings the waters back together,
Right.
and then the waters, recede, and he says he's not going to flood the earth again. What does he put in the sky to promise him to
Bow.
a bow to remind himself? And so so it's like, is that Marduk's bow? I mean,
Right.
so it's really, so Genesis is much, we've become so kind of obsessed with the age of the earth, but Genesis is much more concerned with responding to the Babylonian myths,
Right.
and the epic. And so you have Babylonian epic culture where Gilgamesh is trying to achieve immortality, and of course, what's in this story as Gilgamesh is trying to achieve immortality? Well, there's a snake that takes it away from him. There's God puts Adam to sleep to create the woman, to create Eve. And God himself rests. But of course, what's a way for Gilgamesh to reach immortality? There's like 3 different ways, three different trials. One of them is stay awake for 7 days.
Yeah.
Right. So, and he runs into a guy, Atrahasis Utnapishtim, which is the Noah figure, and he's the one telling Gilgamesh how to achieve immortality, and he's trying to achieve immortality all these ways through his epic battles and his this epic culture. And he's got his buddy, his frenemy Enkidu, who's like, he fights, and Enkidu ends up falling after a goddess, and he ends up dying, and all this stuff, and you see that the culture is so different than what's introduced in Genesis. And how does Abraham live on?
Right.
Through his children.
Yeah.
Right, and it's a domesticated lifestyle rather than the epic Babylonian, the mythic epic culture, right? And so that's that's what Genesis is responding to, right? And that's what it's concerned with.
Well, you were saying, because I read that I think it was our freshman year we read that, and you were saying all those weird names.
Oh, did you? The
Enuma
Enuma Elish,
No, Gilgamesh.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, that's all a part of the same.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So Gilgamesh actually, it's I think in order to understand Genesis, it's really helpful to read those.
Right.
Because this is what Genesis is responding to and saying, no. There's no council of the gods.
Right.
There's one God. He creates everything through his word.
Right.
Right. And he is in control, and he loves us. Right, because the Babylonian gods don't love people. They create. You know why they create humans? I don't know if you remember this from the epic. They create humans because the Babylonian gods, are digging the Euphrates River out, and they say, we don't want to do this anymore. We need to create somebody who's going to do this for us. So they create humans to dig out the Euphrates River, and that's how the Euphrates River is formed in that epic, and it's like, and it's funny because when you read in Genesis, you see the Euphrates and the Tigris flowing out of the river that goes through the Garden of Eden,
right?
And so that's just, in Genesis, it's just a part of the creation,
right?
So
nobody had to dig it out.
That's right. No one had to dig it out, like that would even be possible or something. So anyway, I think that's what's important especially when we think about the age question. That's a really important. I think that's the approach that we should be taking.
Okay, yeah.
Right, because that's what Genesis is concerned with.
Right.
Yeah.
Just age isn't as much of a big deal as the bigger picture.
Yeah. Well, I think what's happened is, I think that question is kind of in the air because of Darwinism from the 19th century and up through today. And so what ends up happening is, instead of reading Genesis on its own terms, we read it on Darwinian terms to push back against Darwinism.
Right.
And there's plenty there that can, like, you can use it for that, which is fine.
Right.
But that's not the conversation partner that I think Genesis has in mind.
Okay.
Genesis is a completely different conversation partner, and when we allow the Darwinian conversation to eclipse the conversation, the original conversation in Genesis, I think we lose a lot of Genesis.
Yeah.
We lose a lot of Genesis by doing that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's all the questions I had.
Okay.
I mean, if you had anything else.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, Genesis is a great book. Though. I mean, we
Yeah.
could talk for a
Oh,
long
yeah.
time about Genesis. But I think this is good. We had kind of surveyed the book and addressed different questions. Of course, we didn't address everything,
Right.
but addressed different questions. And so I would encourage anyone, if you're interested in reading through Genesis, do it.
Oh yeah.
Read it.
I learned a lot.
Good. I'm glad.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And
I'm looking forward to everything else that we're gonna do.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So why don't you say what are we planning on doing?
So are we doing first and second?
First and second.
Yeah, first and second Kings.
First and second Kings. So when we come back, that's what we'll have. We'll be talking about we'll begin with the kind of the death of David, which you'll read in First Kings at the beginning, and then Solomon, and then the division of the kingdom, and
Right.
Elijah and Elisha, and it'll all end with the Babylonian captivity.
Okay.
Yeah. So
That's basically history of Israel.
yeah, that's a big part of the
Yeah.
history of Israel.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
so look forward to that, and
Oh, yeah.
but thank you for talking through Genesis with me.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And thank y'all for joining us, and we'll see you next time for First and Second Kings.
See ya.